Well, we've been looking in our last session at some of the biblical evidence, the crucial matter of trying to consider the meaning of Sunday and its relationship to Sabbath and the fourth commandment. And we looked first at the fundamental question: was the Sabbath in the Old Testament a matter of creation or a matter of Mount Sinai? And I tried to argue vigorously it's a matter of creation. It's a creation ordinance. It was originally intended for all mankind. It's not limited to salvation. And then we began to look at those texts advanced to claim that in the New Covenant all days are alike, that the Sabbath is definitely set aside. Certainly if all days are alike, there can be no Sabbath or really hardly any continuing significance to the fourth commandment in the New Covenant. And I was looking at the first verses usually advanced to that point and arguing that we have to see them in context. We have to see that the context of what Paul is saying about weaker and stronger brethren is a context of very much of loving the brother and not wanting to harm the brother. And so what he's saying there is preeminently advice to the strong to be patient with the weak. And he sort of sums that up in verse 21 of chapter 14 of Romans when he said, "It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble." So if the weaker brethren is really troubled by people who eat meat or who drink wine, for the sake of the weaker brother, you should give that up. And that's the basic point he's arguing. And so then he brings up the matter of days, but as I tried to argue last time, I think days there are very much in context of something else that the weaker brother invents to help him in his weakness to battle against his fleshly desires. And so if days of fasting, if days of prayer, if special holidays somehow help the weaker brother, you should be patient with that. And if we say, well, how likely is it that people were inventing special days for themselves? Well, we only have to look at church history. And we see in church history people invent special days all the time. And we should not be overly surprised that that kind of invention might have happened early on. In any case, I think it's very hard to make the case that Paul is talking about Jewish institutions here. There's no Jewish institution that you have to abstain from wine. That's not taught anywhere in the Old Testament, unless you've taken a Nazirite vow. There's no indication in the Old Testament that you have to abstain entirely from meat and just eat vegetables. But that's what Paul is talking about here. Romans 14, verse 2. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. That would be hard for me, to love the brethren enough to only eat vegetables. I espouse the rare exegetical point of view that vegetables are a result of the fall. I'm kidding, of course, but I don't really much care for vegetables, and I am a meat eater. It's amazing I've lived as long as I have. But Paul, you see, is really focused on the question of loving the brethren. So if the brethren in their weakness don't want to eat meat and don't want to drink wine because it helps them struggle against their fleshly desires, if they invent days to help remind them of their struggle against fleshly desires, respect all that, even though the stronger brother knows that meat's fine, wine's fine in moderation, and that all days are alike. He's not talking about the Sabbath here. That's my point. The Sabbath is not in view here. And to try to illustrate that, and I've not talked to the learned brethren about this, so I don't know how far this argument will go, but I'm wondering if one of the weaker brethren in Romans raised his hand and said, "Paul, I think we should abstain from wine, so I'm not willing to drink communion wine." What do you think Paul would have said? I think he would have said, well, of course you have to drink the communion wine. It's fine for you in general to have these principles you try to live by, but the institution of the church requires that you have communion wine. You don't have to drink wine all the time. You don't have to drink a lot of wine. I don't think they had little thimbles in those days, but nonetheless, you can just take a little sip. But you see, I don't think what Paul is saying here to help the strong love the weak and the weak love the strong is our advice that applies in every situation always. He's focused rather narrowly on special situations there that I don't think can be applied at all to the question of the Sabbath day. I think if you had said to Paul, all days are alike, so the fourth commandment has no relevance to us, I think Paul would have said the same about the communion wine. You're crazy to make that kind of leap. There's no connection here. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about loving the brethren and about things indifferent that we're talking about. So I just don't think that it speaks to the issue at all. It doesn't prove that Sunday is a Sabbath. It just can't be used to eliminate any kind of Sabbath background to understanding Sunday in the New Covenant. So that's the first text frequently alleged, and I think it just doesn't apply. It's true, and I think it's clear. I don't think it's really a hard question as to whether Romans 14 applies to this question or not. It just doesn't. It's clear to me, at least. Secondly, then, we turn to Galatians 4, verse 10. As another verse frequently cited in this discussion. Galatians 4, verse 10 says, "You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain." Oh, well now, maybe this comes closer to the matter at hand. You notice, though, there's no explicit mention of Sabbath here. So once again, we are left with asking, what exactly is Paul arguing? What exactly is Paul talking about? And what leads him to make this comment? Well, Paul is talking in Galatians about the law and the proper and the improper uses of the law. And this section of the letter to the Galatians is very much about that. In chapter 3, verse 19, Paul has raised the question, why was the law added? The promise came first to Abraham, and then later the law was added to Moses. Why was the law added? Well, it was added, Paul says, because of transgressions. It was added to teach you that you were sinners. That's what Paul is saying. That's what he says a number of places in the New Testament about why the law was added at Sinai. And he discusses that then, and then sort of concludes his argument, or maybe shifts the argument a little bit, down at Galatians 4, verse 21. "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law?" And I think there he's saying, the law was added because of transgressions. Are you listening to the law and learning that you're sinners? And he's saying, no, you've missed the whole point. You're looking to the law to make you right with God. And in trying to do that, you've missed the whole point. The law won't make you right with God. The law will teach you that you're sinners if you understand the law. But if you learn from the law that you're sinners, then you have to learn to look somewhere else for salvation. Salvation is not to be found in the law. Salvation is to be found in Christ, in the promise, in the grace of God, in the work of God. So, he says, in the middle of this discussion of law, you observe days and months and seasons and years. You're observing, most likely, the Mosaic calendar in hopes of making yourself right with God. In the Mosaic calendar, there were days, Sabbath to be sure, but other days as well. There were months, there were seasons, there were years. there was an elaborate calendar that Moses had received at Sinai that Israel was to keep. And Paul is saying, if you think by keeping that calendar, you're going to be justified, you're going to be right with God, you're profoundly wrong. You're missing the whole point. That's not what the law is meant to teach you. And so stop this effort to justify yourself by keeping the Mosaic law. Don't keep all these Mosaic holidays. So does this relate to the Sabbath question or not? Well, I think if you think you're going to be justified by keeping the Sabbath day holy, it may apply to you. The Sabbath isn't going to make you holy. The Sabbath isn't going to justify you. But beyond that, this verse doesn't really relate to whether the Sabbath has some continuing significance for us or not. It's not what Paul's talking about. It's really quite a terrible thing to lift verses out of context and quote them as if they're decisive without the context. Christians have regularly been seriously astray by lifting verses out of context. And in context, I just don't think this relates to the issue at hand any more than Romans did. It at least is talking about Moses. I think it is talking about uses of the Mosaic law, but I don't think it can be quoted to relate specifically to the question of keeping the Sabbath. Now, there's one more verse. It's sort of interesting that there are only these three sections in the New Testament that can be significantly quoted to deny a continuing application of the fourth commandment. You'd think if this was really a major concern of the apostles, in light of how important the Sabbath was in the Old Testament, that then there'd be a lot of discussion of it in the New Testament. But it's not what we find. But we need to look at this last verse because it's probably the most significant. And this is Colossians chapter 2 at verse 16. Colossians chapter 2 at verse 16. This is different from the Romans passage, I think, because it really is talking about Mosaic institutions, Old Testament institutions. It's also different from the Galatians passage because it's not talking about justification. It really is talking more about sanctification. And so in a sense, it is more directly relevant to the question at hand. And not only that, but it specifically mentions the Sabbath. So now we're really at the heart of things. But I do want you to keep in mind that this means that the side that wants to insist that every day is alike has one verse out of the Bible. Now, one verse is all it takes. If you have one verse, you win the argument. But it should at least give us pause when we realize that such a huge argument is depending on one verse. Paul's talking about the triumph of Christ, the glory of Christ, about how we mustn't let human traditions or attitudes of this world control us when we're in Christ. And then he comes to Colossians 2, verse 16, and he says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." Now, Paul here is drawing a contrast between the substance, the fullness of what Christians have received in Christ, and the shadows that came before to prepare for the coming of Christ. And so I think he is talking about institutions of the Mosaic economy, questions of food and drink. In the Old Testament, there were kosher laws, right? There were foods that were unclean. There were foods that were forbidden to be eaten. And those things were a shadow pointing to the fact that we are to be a holy people. We don't need that shadow anymore. We've been fulfilled, in a sense, in Christ. So I think what Paul is teaching there is really rather clear. And he said that's true of the Mosaic calendar as well. The festivals of the Mosaic economy were shadows, and the substance is fulfilled in Christ. You can go right down the festivals of Israel, can't you? The Passover, that points to Christ as the lamb whose blood causes the angel of death to pass over us. Or the Day of Atonement, that points to Christ. All the festivals of Israel can be seen as pointing in one way or another to Christ and to the fullness of what's in him. Or a new moon, that celebration of monthly changes in the life of the people was celebrating the Old Covenant. Or a Sabbath. Now we come to the sort of heart of the question before us. It's interesting in Greek that the word there is a plural, or Sabbaths. Now, I don't want to suggest the translation is necessarily wrong here. It is true that sometimes in Greek the plural was used just to the Sabbath in general. But it could mean a reference to the whole sabbatical structure and principle. There are all sorts of Sabbaths in the Mosaic economy, not just a Sabbath day, but a Sabbath year. There were various Sabbaths in the Mosaic economy. So it's possible that Paul is not talking here so much about the creation ordinance as he's talking about the broader elaboration of the Mosaic structure of Sabbaths. I think that's not a bad exegesis. I heard that interestingly argued by a Seventh-day Adventist who wanted to argue that we're obligated to a seventh-day Sabbath. And so he wanted this verse to have nothing to do with Sabbath as a creation ordinance. And that led me to pause and think. I think maybe Paul is saying we are not bound by a seventh-day Sabbath. I think that's what Paul is saying here. The church never worshiped on Saturday. The church never found itself worshiping God on the old Sabbath. Because I think Paul is teaching us here that old Sabbath, that seventh-day Sabbath, is fulfilled in Christ. Why is it fulfilled in Christ? It's fulfilled in Christ because Israel was waiting for the fulfillment. It worked and then it rested. It worked and looked forward to rest. It worked and then waited for fulfillment. And in the new covenant, I think the church begins the week resting because there's fulfillment in Christ. We've already begun to experience the rest that will one day be fulfilled completely when he returns again in glory. And so there is a sense in which the seventh-day Sabbath has passed away. And I think this verse is very useful to make that point. Do you know why Seventh-day Adventists worship on Saturday? Because Ellen G. White, their prophetess, had a vision of the Ten Commandments with a halo around the fourth commandment. And she concluded from that the church had been disobedient in not worshiping on Saturday instead of Sunday all these centuries. I don't find that all that convincing as exegesis. We're not guided by the visions of prophets since the days of the apostles and prophets. So I think actually this is an encouragement to us to ask what is shadow and what is substance? What is anticipation? What is fulfillment? And we see when we think about that in reference to the New Testament that as a New Testament people, we live both in the days of fulfillment, but also in the days of still anticipation, don't we? We have both things. We have fulfillment and we have anticipation of greater fulfillment. And you can think about that in a number of ways. Think about circumcision in the Old Covenant. It was a sign of forgiveness of sins, of covenant, of connection to God. And when the New Covenant came, circumcision was fulfilled. And baptism came in its place. Baptism as a sign of washing and cleansing. But we're still waiting for the perfect fulfillment of cleansing, aren't we? We're not yet fully perfect. We are not yet those whose sins have been entirely washed away. So circumcision is fulfilled in baptism, but baptism yet awaits the perfection of its message in the return of Christ. We can see that, I think, to some extent with Israel, national Israel, the nation of Israel. Israel always pointed forward. It was never an end in itself. It always pointed to something beyond itself. It pointed to the church. Not where Jews are excluded, but where Jews are joined by Gentiles. The promise to Abraham was, in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so God prepared for that in Israel, and then Israel's reality was fulfilled in the church. And yet the church still waits the final fulfillment in glory. And I think we can say the same thing is happening here with the Sabbath as a creation ordinance. It's fulfilled then in Sunday as the creation ordinance shifted in the new covenant to the day of Christ's resurrection, but still waiting for its ultimate fulfillment when we enter into the full and final rest. So that's what I think we should be anticipating here. Yes, Sabbath, seventh-day Sabbath, is a shadow of things to come, but it doesn't mean that the whole principle that underlay the creation Sabbath is gone. It's not gone. There is no clear teaching in the New Testament that the Sabbath principle is fulfilled and gone in Christ. And these verses, I don't think, teach that. I don't think these verses demonstrate that. And I think the people who quote them are very sincere in their quoting, but I think they're wrong. I don't think these verses teach what they claim to teach. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, being a skeptical group, that is this just theological spinning I'm doing? Changing 7 to first day, talking about difference between substance and fulfillment. Does the New Testament actually teach that stuff? Or am I just wishing it did? Well, that's what we'll have to come back next time and see. What does the New Testament teach positively about Sunday and about its relationship to the fourth commandment? Thank you.